Few works are as well loved and as well read as Madame Bovary, 1856, and Anna Karenina, 1877. Yet remarkably little academic literature has been devoted to the manifest links between them, or the influence Gustave Flaubert had on his admirer Leo Tolstoy. The two adultery novels share more than strikingly similar plots. Both Emma and Anna are symbolically linked to birds, and their lovers to horses. A ball determines their fate, while the opera sets the stage for their social scandal. Deformed peasants haunt their dreams and ultimately foreshadow their suicides, and both women are associated with mist, haze, and fog almost incessantly. Further research reveals that Tolstoy visited Paris just as Flaubert's novel was making its infamous debut. His library contained a heavily annotated translation of Madame Bovary, and when asked to discuss French literature some decades later, the Russian author named as his favorite writer, quote, "your incomparable Flaubert." Tolstoy began his work deeply indebted to Flaubert's text. His early drafts of Anna are caricatures of Emma's own parody. As a result, those Western scholars who have noted the ties between the two novels tend to use Flaubert's Emma Bovary as a template for Tolstoy's Anna, seeing Anna's descent into madness as a textbook case in gendered hysteria. My goal in this comparative exercise is somewhat different: to use the conversation between these texts and authors to highlight precisely what dramatic departures Tolstoy chose to make from Flaubert in his treatment of gender roles, literary madness, and the female-coded body. Tolstoy could have used his heroine, as Flaubert does, as a case study in gender fluidity and destabilization, a blank page on which to examine psychiatry's interplay with literary tropes. Instead, his adulteress was, except in one key aspect, the ideal Russian woman. But in radically recasting the gender of bezumie, or literary madness, Tolstoy would ultimately inspire a movement in Russian women's writing that continues to this day and continues to be overlooked in Western scholarship. Madame Bovary, writes Janet Bezier, is bounded by medicine and its ironic double. Flaubert's fascination with psychiatry was typical in a time when discussions of hysteria quickly spread from the Parisian clinics to the Parisian literary salon. The mobile, capricious, convulsive body of the female hysteric was a site of gestures and throbbings that only a doctor or writer, usually a male one, could organize into words. But the chimerical nature of the disorder also destabilized the very category it seemed to uphold, gender. The hysteric is hyperbolically female, yet she is also, to the 19th century French mind, a woman who wants to be and is even becoming a man. Flaubert was aware of this slippery gender aspect. He dubbed himself a hysterical old woman, subjected to an agonizing rhythm of inspiration that he compared to a menstrual flow. He was also enamored of the idea that while hysteria in women was obviously a mutilation, a male artist, by taking on feminine sensibilities and subjectivity, could make of himself a heteroclitic whole, a union of masculine and feminine tropes expressly achieved through art instead of nature. Emma Bovary, then, is in some ways the essence of the wandering womb that early writers believed was the cause of hysteric fits. Her blending of masculine-coded desire and women's supposed frustration with lack ultimately renders her incapable of stability or existence. Her temporal bulimia subjects her to bouts of forgetting even as she obsesses over recollection. There is a direct correlation between Emma's refusal to eat, a clinical side effect of hysteria, and digressions into her attempt to devour experience. But Emma's madness is not only caused by her reading, as psychiatrists in Flaubert's time believed. It is also triggered by her very existence as a female literary character, a romantic hodgepodge of sentiment and cliché who has been trapped in the stark irony of a realist novel. Flaubert presents Emma's life as if it were actually produced by her readings instead of her experiences. By the time we meet her, she is already, quote, the beloved of every novel, the heroine of every drama, the vague she of every volume of poetry. Her own bêtises, meanwhile, are countered by the smug idée reçue of Monsieur Homais and other scientific hacks. Thus Emma, and particularly the stresses, rejections, and obsessions of Emma's body, act both as a psychiatric case study on the effect of literature and a literary manifestation of psychiatric troping. There seems to be no such challenge to gender roles in Tolstoy, nor indeed much evidence of a medical or bodily fixation. Anna's warmth, sincerity, and compassion place her firmly within the ideals of 19th century Russian womanhood. She is a devoted mother, and, at least initially, dutiful and supportive spouse, and harbors a deep love for her brother and his children. She is also, in contrast to the clinical and often obsessively detailed descriptions of Emma Bovary's face, eyelashes, hands, feet, described largely in modest generalities. She is full-figured, she is handsome, she is elegant. As a result of his idealized heroine, and his earlier treatments of the so-called woman question in literature, Tolstoy has been blasted as misogynistic by contemporary Western critics. So what then is to be taken from this firmly gender-normed heroine, and the excision of a medicalized madness from this text? In order to understand why Tolstoy made these changes, and to situate us in how different 19th century Russian conceptions of madness and gender are from this French model, we need to travel from Paris to Moscow, from a country that birthed the asylum to one where madness was often venerated, and from a country whose literature was rich in women to one where complex, multi-layered heroines were almost unheard of. It was not until the turn of the 20th century that a medical discourse on madness rooted itself in Russian literature. Melancholy and its related hysteria were often dismissed as Western imports, but other forms of delirium, from delusions to psychosis, carried a symbolic value, a positive one, that far outweighed any medical legal status. It testifies to the strength of anti-empiricism in Russian philosophical thought, that there was in Tolstoy's time a strong link between frenzy and irrationality and metaphysical superiority, a superiority, it is important to note, overwhelmingly tied to men. In Russian literature, then, madness was in the 19th century not so much proof of mental affliction or moral corruption as a manifestation of legitimate existential crisis. Bezumie, a potent illustration of the ways in which society, in fact existence at large, could become spiritually and intellectually unbearable. Anna Karenina stands out in the great realist tradition for having a complexity and depth to rival literary men. After all, from Pushkin on, the at times overwrought elevation of the Russian woman, forever pure, forever giving, forever maternal, had one purpose, as Barbara Helt puts it, to be, quote, used lavishly in a discourse of male self-definition. But it is Anna's descent into madness and her link to broader male-coded existential themes in this text that takes her character from the intriguing to the remarkable. The problem that obsessed Tolstoy most, far beyond adultery, is also what binds Anna to the other half of the novel, the side narrated by Konstantin Levin. This problem is the inevitability of death, and the